In this video, we're going to talk about examples of viral infections. First, let's talk about plant viruses. Now, viruses for plants can be transmitted two different possible ways. Horizontal transmission means that you have one plant. We'll just make like a little flower here or something that is able to transmit the virus to another plant nearby. And it might be through direct contact, it might be from pollen being transferred from one plant to another. It could be from an insect bite that basically makes a wound in the plant tissue and allows a virus to get into the plant.
Now, vertical transmission has to do with the plant that passes the virus onto its offspring. So this could be something like forming seeds that fall to the ground, and now that seed is carrying the virus with it. Or it could be that part of the plant breaks off and is propagated, and the new plant that is made from that also has the virus. There are several different ways that plant viruses can be seen or observed. So plants have symptoms just like animals do when it comes to viral infections. So one example would be hyperplasia, and hyper means too much. So in this case, we're talking about too much cell growth, and it's going to form things like tumors or galls, and that's what this picture right here is showing. So this is a gall, which is a form of tumor. Another symptom of plant viruses is hypoplasia. Hypo means not enough. And so this would be something like thinning leaves, yellow spots on the leaves, or maybe the plant just not growing as quickly as it should. Necrosis is another way of saying cell death. So you tend to see blackened spots. You can also have just abnormal growth patterns. So the plant might be growing in a different shape, or not growing as quickly, or maybe growing just in a strange way. And then other discolorations and patterns can also be symptoms of plant viruses, such as what we're seeing here with this tomato plant.
Like plant viruses, animal viruses can also be transmitted horizontally and or vertically. So horizontal transmission occurs between one person and another person.
Horizontal transmission includes the virus being spread through bodily fluids, and with the type of bodily fluid depends on the virus. And by bodily fluids, we're referring to things like blood, things like saliva, mucus, semen, vaginal secretions, etc., etc. Now, this transmission can be either direct or indirect. So, direct means that essentially the two people have to touch each other and be in close contact. Indirect means that sometimes viruses can live outside of a host for at least a limited amount of time. And so it could be that you could have viral particles on your hand and you touch a doorknob, and the viral particles transfer to the doorknob, and then the next person that comes along and touches that doorknob can then potentially get the virus from that. And some viruses are better able to survive in an outside external environment like that than others. Vertical transmission includes a virus being transmitted from a parent to the offspring, and this most often occurs during delivery, so childbirth. And it's especially more likely to happen if the fetus or the baby comes in direct contact with the mom's bodily fluid, such as blood or breast milk. So one example of vertical transmission could be something like HIV, which is the human immunodeficiency virus, which is the virus that causes the condition known as AIDS. Now, there are ways to reduce the likelihood of vertical transmission happening. So, just because a woman has HIV doesn't necessarily mean that her baby will also have the virus. So, things like taking antiviral medications during pregnancy in order to decrease the amount of virus present can help. Things like not breastfeeding, so formula feeding instead of breastfeeding. And even sometimes things like a C-section might help to reduce the transmission of the virus between the mom and the baby. There is a variety of how animal viruses infect their organisms. So infections can fall into one of these categories. So infections can be acute, chronic, latent with intermittent symptoms, asymptomatic, or even oncogenic. And on the following slides, we're going to talk about each one of these infections or types of infections in more detail.
So first we'll talk about acute infections. And acute infections are the type of infections where a virus infects a host and the host gets sick and has symptoms, but the host immune system fights to basically kill or eliminate the virus from the body. So essentially you get sick, your immune system fights it, you get sick as your immune system is fighting the virus, but then you ultimately recover and the virus is no longer in your body. Alternatively, you could die, but hopefully your immune system is able to fight off the virus and you are done with it. So some examples of acute infections include things like the common cold, the flu,
and more recently, the coronavirus that caused COVID-19. Chronic infections differ from acute infections in that once an organism is infected, the virus is always going to be present. Now, the immune system can suppress the viral activity to try to keep it under control and in check, but the virus never actually goes away. It's still always going to be present in that organism. And over time, these chronic infections can cause damage that leads to bigger problems. So, for example, hepatitis C is a virus that over time can damage the liver and lead to the liver no longer being able to perform its function. Another example of a chronic infection would be HIV. And HIV stands for human immunodeficiency virus. And this is the virus that ultimately can lead to the condition known as AIDS. And AIDS stands for acquired immunodeficiency syndrome. And so this is an example. HIV is a chronic infection that over time, as it damages the immune system more and more, it can lead to this condition known as AIDS, which can ultimately lead to someone dying from a secondary infection because their immune system is no longer able to fight off these other infections. Viruses can also be latent, and latent is kind of a type of chronic infection in that the virus is always staying in the body, but the symptoms might go through these kind of cycles or periods of being latent or dormant, meaning that the symptoms are not going to occur during those times. But certain things can reactivate the virus and cause the virus to start replicating again, and this leads to symptoms occurring. And oftentimes this reactivation occurs when the immune system is suppressed. So this can be when someone is maybe sick with a different disease, or if they're on immunosuppressant medication, or if they're just stressed. These are all things that can maybe cause outbreaks of these viral symptoms to occur again. Some examples of latent or viruses that can cause latent infections include the herpes simplex virus. And this is the virus that can cause either sores on the genitals. So that would be a sexually transmitted disease. Or it can also be, there's an oral form that causes cold sores. And so these sores can develop, and then the immune system can suppress the virus and make them go away. But then if something else happens, a stressful event, or something happened with the immune system being suppressed, the sores can come back. Another example is the varicella zoster virus, and this is the virus that causes chickenpox. Which back in my day, we did not have a vaccine for chickenpox. So most of the people in my generation got chickenpox as a child. And if you have chickenpox, you then have a chance of developing a kind of a reoccurrence of that virus. It causes a kind of a different set of symptoms called shingles, which can be really painful. And this is a shingles rash in this picture here. Now, some viruses are asymptomatic. Remember that when you have an A before a word, it usually means without. So asymptomatic means without symptoms. So in this case, the virus is present, but symptoms are not occurring. Now, the virus may still be transmissible, meaning that you might still be able to pass it on to another person, even if you're not experiencing symptoms. And some viruses might be asymptomatic to certain people, but symptomatic to others. So some examples, remember we just talked about the herpes simplex virus, which can be a latent virus, but it can also be asymptomatic in some people. So it's possible that someone might not even know that they have the virus and still be able to pass it on to someone that they're in close contact with. We also recently went through the COVID-19 pandemic, and remember COVID-19 is caused by a type of virus called a coronavirus. And some people had asymptomatic coronavirus infections, meaning that they had the virus in their body, but they did not get sick from it. The problem is they could still spread that virus to other people, and other people might not be so lucky and develop symptoms that can be potentially really serious or even fatal. And last but not least, some infections can be oncogenic. And onco, this prefix, has to do with cancer. So there are some viruses that can actually cause cancer, and they do so by altering the cell cycle. Because remember that cancer is just uncontrolled cell division. So when your cells go through mitosis over and over again without ever being stopped, you develop this kind of these extra cells that aren't supposed to be there, which starts to form a tumor, which can then potentially break off and become metastatic. So some examples of viruses that can be oncogenic include things like some of the hepatitis viral strains that can cause liver cancer. HPV, which is the human papillomavirus, this is one that can cause a lot of reproductive cancers. Most notably, it can cause cervical cancer, but it can also cause other cancers associated with the reproductive organs. And one kind of interesting thing about both of these is that there are vaccines available to prevent you getting sick or getting cancer from these viruses. Now, it's important to note that the same virus can actually exhibit different types of these infections. So let's talk about this HPV virus here, this human papillomavirus. In some people, HPV can be asymptomatic, so they might not even know that they have it. In some people, it can be acute, meaning that their immune system is able to fight off the virus and clear it out of the body. In some people, it can be latent, so it might cause things like genital warts that can come and go, depending on whether the virus is active or not. It can be chronic in that it's always in your body, potentially building up damage to the body over time, and it can be oncogenic. So it really depends on what strain of the virus is causing the infection. It also depends on the host organism, and it depends on things like how strong the host organism's immune system is, or if they have access to maybe certain treatments in order to prevent the infection from causing damage or cancer.